Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm once again joined by my colleague, Rhian Greaves, who's going to be taking us through our health, safety and environmental legal update. Rather than me introduce Rhian, she knows herself far better than I do, and she's just taken on a really great new role since we last spoke. So Rhian, just want to tell us what your role is, what you're doing now, and just introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I've just taken on a new role as a legal director at DAC BEACHCROFT based in Manchester. And it's a really exciting opportunity for me because DAC is one of the biggest regulatory safety health environment teams in the country. And what I really liked about the firm, one of the things that really attracted me to it is their local presence. So I'm in Manchester, but I've got colleagues right around the country, Leeds, Birmingham, Newcastle, all the way up in Scotland and Edinburgh and Glasgow, and also over in Northern Ireland as well, and in the south. So what that means is it's just much easier to offer clients that service, particularly when you have an incident and you have to have boots on the ground pretty quickly in order to help clients through tricky situations. So yeah, it's a great opportunity for me. I'm going to be doing the same as I've been doing for many years now, which is advising clients in relation to their regulatory interactions, so with the likes of the HSE and the Environment Agency, but also looking at the compliance piece, any training that we can assist clients with, and advising them as they develop and as they get back to work after the pandemic. So it's all going well so far. I'm settling in still remotely, as you can see.
Yeah.
But yeah, so far so good.
Hey, that's fantastic. I didn't realize that you did training as well. You know, I didn't realize that was a part of the offer.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we do a lot of talking to clients about is incident preparedness in particular, right, and crisis management planning. Because I think from our perspective, and certainly from my own practice, I've seen many times that the way that a business responds to an adverse incident in particular, in really the first 48 hours after an event has happened, really has a huge bearing on where they end up and how well they come out the other side, both from a legal perspective, but also from a reputational perspective as well. And so we do lots of work with clients in really mapping out those kind of scenarios. And yeah, it's not something that everybody wants to think about, you know, that worst case scenario where you have a serious incident. But you do see that clients that have planned for it are quicker to mobilise really, and to handle things responsibly, and in a way that best protects both the organisation and the people within it. So we will often sort of map out that scenario with them, and as part of that, we offer a bespoke training programme so that we can help those people who might be called upon to respond, to understand the framework that they'll find themselves in. So to understand the fact that, as your members will know, breach of a health and safety law is a criminal offence, and that you find yourself in a criminal investigation process, and really what does that look like and how does that feel?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I know you do environmental issues and food safety as well. You told me about last time we spoke too. So for anybody listening to this, Rhian's really active on LinkedIn. She'd absolutely welcome you linking in, I'm sure. And thanks for that. So when you were talking there, and it's something we're going to pick up here in a moment. Now seems a good time to talk about the role of expert witnesses. You spoke about swiftness of response, and I suppose when I've always thought about expert witnesses, it's bringing them to give evidence. But I know you use, well, your profession uses them to get to a scene very, very quickly, to start assessing, looking at what could have gone wrong and how. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the role of the expert witness? I think it's much more multifaceted than I certainly considered it to be.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It's very much a case-by-case decision, really, as to whether you need an expert at all, and if so, when you need them. Sometimes that will be driven by the nature of the incident. And some experts are really, really good at helping people like me to understand a technical process, for example. Some sort of industrial setting. Perhaps you might have a piece of machinery that's been involved in an incident. You might want to have that examined pretty quickly to understand if there is a fault, and if so, what that was. And sometimes it will be driven by how the investigators respond to an incident. So if the HSE turn up on site and they quickly bring in one of their specialist inspectors, so one of their own expert witnesses, you will often look to match that, really, to understand, have your own person look at the same scenario, so that you are both working from the same base set of facts, if you like. Other times, it may not become apparent that you'll need an expert until perhaps you've been prosecuted and you've been served with the evidence. At which point you might see, okay, we need to get someone in to help us out with it. And ultimately, yes, I mean, experts are called on to give evidence if there's a trial. But sometimes it's simply their report will be enough to help somebody like me to get my client to where they want to be, and whether that's in relation to mitigation, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later on, or whether indeed it's about actually defending them in a criminal setting. And so the expert, once you get into the court, they have a duty effectively to the court. Obviously, like all witnesses, they have to tell the truth. But the difference between them and your normal witness of fact is that they are able, by virtue of their expertise, to give an opinion. So if you or I is asked to give evidence in a trial, as a layperson, if you like, we're not allowed to say, well, in my opinion, this is what happened, because what does our opinion count for?
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas because they have the credibility of the qualifications and the experience and so on and so forth, you're saying through their expertise they have the right to give the court an opinion as to something that's happened. But they can be very, very useful if you find the right expert, which is often a challenge, but they can be very, very useful in helping to demystify industrial processes. Sometimes with clients, because they're so used to dealing with the process, they live it day in, day out, and they assume that everybody else understands it as well. Whereas, for example, if you're having a Crown Court trial, you've not only got a judge, but you've got 12 members of the jury who've probably never set foot in that particular type of workplace before, who will need some help to understand what's happened in fairly simple terms.
So you alluded to the fact there that it must be very difficult to find an expert witness, because you want somebody who's a good communicator, I suppose, someone who's technically, well, an expert. And I know I've certainly spoken to people who have suggested about positioning themselves as an expert, where, for what my opinion matters, but you just think, I'm not sure you really meet the criteria. So where do you go when you're looking to find an expert, particularly if, as you've said, there's been some horrible event on a site somewhere? You want to get your expert there quickly, don't you, to be able to start looking at the evidence? Is there any sort of membership organizations you go to then, or
No, exactly. I mean, there are a lot of them will come from sort of fairly well-known consultancies, for example. Engineering consultancies and that kind of thing. And finding the right expert is always a challenge. For us, because we deal with criminal cases, we do have that added box to check, if you like, to see whether somebody has actually given evidence before. Because there are lots of experts who give evidence routinely in civil cases, but civil case, the whole purpose of the civil procedure rules is to drive you towards a settlement and not having to go to trial. So a lot of them have done a lot of legal work, but have never actually had to stand in the witness box and present themselves in that way. So that sort of complicates it a little bit from our perspective. And I think it's one of those things you get sense over time. You sometimes have cases where you have repeat issues that you've dealt with previously, or similar sorts of ideas that you need to deal with. There are a lot of people who will say they're experts, but their expertise, anybody I think who claims to be an expert in more than about two things, you have to wonder. You do get experts who are, who say that they're, they've got a list of 12 or 15 bullet points of things that they can advise you on, and you have to question that. But the difficulty, of course, is once you know who the good experts are, everybody else knows too, and they're really hard to get hold of.
No, I know you said that could be a frustration, but I know that's brilliant. Thank you for that. So you mentioned a minute ago that we spoke last time about mitigation, and it, there was quite a bit of information, bit of sharing of questions over the socials. So I'm just looking down at my notes here. Could you just give us a very quick update on as to how you interpret mitigation to be, and then I'd really like to explore with you is and it was two of the questions that came through is mitigation admittance of guilt, and what does good mitigation look like?
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, mitigation for somebody like me is a huge part of what we do. If I give you an example, the HSE's got a 95% conviction rate, which means that in 95% of cases that we deal with, we are dealing with mitigation at some point.
Right, okay.
And so, yeah, it's a huge part of what we do. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about incident preparedness. Sometimes mitigation starts on day one because, there's a problem and there's a problem. And that's when you start it. Again, sometimes it's later, it's on a case-by-case basis. But I guess mitigation is probably best described as, okay, you're guilty, but you're putting your best foot forward. You are trying to explain what's happened and why, and also what's changed, really.
Right.
So in answer to one of the questions that you've had following our last session, yeah, I mean, mitigation, you have admitted your guilt at that point.
Right.
One of the classic questions we will get is, a client will do an internal investigation and it will identify perhaps a flaw or a training requirement. And they will say, okay, but if I suddenly put my staff through this training now, the HSE are going to know that we didn't do it in the first place. And therefore, I'm going to flag to the HSE that I haven't done all that's reasonably practicable, and therefore I'm going to be in trouble. Yep. And the answer to that is unavoidably, yeah, of course you are. However, as a business, as an employer, you've got an ongoing duty to manage health and safety. And if, God forbid, you had the same situation happen again, and you knew that you needed this training requirement and you hadn't done it, you're in a far worse position than you are now. And so there's always that tension, and it's a discussion to have with clients about how to go about it. But yes, you are, we mitigate when we're pleading guilty, is the long and short of it. And so that's why that's why we do so much of it, because I say in 95% of cases the HSE is getting their conviction.
Yeah. So in terms of what good mitigation looks like then, or what will serve you well, in terms of what you're introducing, is it really a case of just putting everything you can in place to prevent reoccurrence, which is what anybody would, with any sense and decency, would do anyway? But is that really it in a nutshell?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. That's part of it. I mean, mitigation has always been important. I think for leaders of businesses now, they can see much more clearly the value of it since the sentencing guidelines changed in 2016. So since we had this much greater emphasis on financial penalties and the size of financial penalties, it's kind of pushed businesses into a situation where much sooner they're having to say, okay, we think we've got a problem here. How are we going to solve it? And the sentencing guidelines really set out what good mitigation looks like. And they set for us a fairly familiar pattern that we'll follow case after case. And you'll be looking really, I mean, the things that would be good mitigation are your health and safety performance generally. So it's always great to be able to say to a court, this is a first conviction. Yep. Effectively, you're of good character. They will look at what steps you have taken to remedy the deficiencies, particularly where you've done that voluntarily. So the HSE haven't had to come along and serve an improvement notice on you to make you do it. You've looked at it yourself and you've identified what needs to be done, and then you've done it. Because one of the most important things for someone like me standing up in court is to be able to say to the court, this happened, we're very sorry, but it's not going to happen again, and these are the reasons why. Yeah. Because it shows that the corporate entity has learned from what's happened and has been willing to act on the findings really of the investigation. the other thing that I think helps with good mitigation is the way that a business responds to being under investigation, not just the way that they deal with the HSE. And that goes back to that crisis management point and the training that I talked about a little bit earlier on. You want to be able to be putting your best foot forward, but there can be a tendency to try and guard information, or to perhaps not fully cooperate, because you're worried about handing over information which is damaging.
Yeah.
But the sentencing guidelines that have a specific section in them which say effectively, have you cooperated really beyond the type of cooperation we'd always expect? So how have you behaved since this? And that's not just from a legal perspective, it's a moral perspective as well. How have employees been treated? Where there's an injured person, how has that worked out? The worst case scenario, if you've had a fatality, how have you reacted to that? So that's why having that mapping session and understanding what happens and how to deal with it is really, really important, because when something goes wrong, there's panic and there's chaos if you've not thought about it. There's an awful lot to think about, and there's an awful lot going on, and that's why we try to talk to people up front about it, because it is so important. And I think for me, really, the reality of it is a good mitigation is a combination of how the company behaves, the changes that they've made, a really genuine feeling of remorse that you're able to demonstrate, and sometimes it will also involve wider issues. So sometimes it's difficult. Some people have a view, magistrates might have a view, judges might have a view of what a big company is like, and sometimes you want to humanize that, and point to the good things that companies do, because there are so many good businesses out there who have really robust corporate social responsibility offenders. They're part of the local community, they're helping out local charities and that kind of thing. So sometimes that will form a part of it too.
That's a brilliant answer, Rhian. I think there's so many sort of takeaways from that as well. Actually, that was brilliant. No, thank you for that. Seriously. So what I'd like to talk to you about then is the new changes to some legislation that's coming up. We spoke about the Fire Safety Act, the Environment Bill, and I know you wanted to bring us up to speed on these points, please.
Yeah, no problem. So since we last spoke, the Fire Safety Bill has become the Fire Safety Act. And what it does, it basically amends the existing fire safety order, and is part of what's going to be a huge package of measures coming from the lessons being learned from the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Obviously that inquiry is ongoing, but these particular measures in the Fire Safety Act are designed to make people feel safe in their homes, really. And it's to introduce measures to make sure that the responsible person from a fire safety perspective, so often that is a business, is assessing and managing the risks that are posed by both the structure of a building, where you've got a multi-occupancy building, a multi-occupancy residential building. So that's also external walls, cladding, of course, which we've heard a lot about, balconies, windows, those sorts of things, doors opening onto common parts. And that's what it's all about, is to make sure that very specifically people who are dealing with those buildings are considering those sorts of issues. So I think really, if you have members who are managing buildings of that nature, it's really to look at your fire risk assessment again now, in light of the changes, to see whether or not there's anything that you need to amend or do differently, really. It doesn't deal with cladding in the sense of there's been a lot made about who's going to pay for the changes that are necessary. It doesn't deal with that. There was quite a debate about that, but that hasn't made it through to the final act. But as I say, if you are managing those buildings, it's a good idea to review the risk assessment now. Yeah.
So is it because from what I read, it just puts the onus on those who have ownership for domiciliary arrangements to assess them in line with the fire safety order. Is have I got that thinking right?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically to be more specific, really, about residential. I think, you know, because Grenfell Tower obviously is the very worst case scenario that we've seen. But there have been tragedies previously. Right. So there was one at Lakenhall House, for example, where it seems that even though the coroner has made recommendations about what should have happened, the lessons clearly hadn't been learned by the time of the awful events at Grenfell. So that's what's driving it all. And as I say, there's a huge package of measures. The building safety regulator, which of course is being set up within the HSE, plays a part. The building safety legislation. So there's a lot coming. And you know, if you are involved in that sector, it's there's going to be a lot of homework to do.
Yeah, no, thanks for the heads up. And you know, it's a timely piece of legislation, as you said, as well, isn't it? It's amazing that it hasn't been recognised before as an absolute necessity. Even I know from talking to people, colleagues at HSE now, as you've said, the building safety regulator work, that's really starting to ramp up now, and the appointments are starting to get filled, and vacancies are now getting filled, and yeah, there's going to be a lot of activity there, and it's just an awful shame that it takes a tragedy such as Grenfell for us to get these things in place, isn't it? I think we all recognise that. So Absolutely. Thanks, Rhian. So the Environment Bill then. It's an exciting day today. What's the date today? 26th of the 5th?
26th of the 5th, yes. The Environment Bill is in Parliament today. It was part of the Queen's speech a few weeks ago. And yeah, it's the report stage today. So MPs will be looking at the bill again. It's a very chunky piece of legislation, but they'll be looking at it again. They'll be looking at any amendments that have been suggested. And they'll be debating it. I think one of the interesting things is the government's been very clear that, you know, what they want to do is to build 5 key principles into how we make our environmental policy decisions going forward as a country. So they'll be looking at things like integrating environmental protection into all of the policy decisions, looking at ways to make sure that the polluter pays. And these are what, you know, none of this is really new stuff, but obviously a lot of it is themes that were enshrined in EU legislation previously, but now post Brexit, that's going to be up to us. So the Environment Bill is happening today. I think there's been quite a lot of frustration, I think is probably the best word, because it's taken a long time. It got stuck, you know, but even before COVID, it got stuck behind Brexit debates, and then obviously COVID really tore up the parliamentary timetable as it existed, because there was so much else that needed to be dealt with. So the bill basically is doing various things for the environment, but it's setting some long-term targets for priority areas such as air quality and biodiversity. And it's also going to put the Secretary of State under a legal duty to hit certain targets.
Oh, wow, okay.
Although how that'll be enforced is still still to be discussed. And the office, it also sets up the Office for Environmental Protection, which is a new watchdog, really, which will look at how public bodies are dealing with their own environmental responsibilities. So it's not going to replace the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency will carry on. But yeah, we'll have this new environmental watchdog as well.
Right. So is there any sort of red flags for business in there you want to pull out, or is it far too easy to say at the moment? Or
I think that's probably a session all of its own. I mean, it's a huge piece of legislation. Right, so yeah, there's quite a lot in it.
Okay, well, that's fine. We'll book you in for it seemed well. Do you think it will get through today, or do you think it will be to go?
No, I mean, it's not the final stage today, so but I think people will be pleased to see that it is moving again.
Right, okay. So we'll get you booked in for about a year's time then, to see where we are then. You mentioned there's a real crackdown on packaging waste at the moment as well. And all, you know, the sort of the concept of the circular economy, getting things recycled and back around. And you also mentioned something called an enforcement undertaking, which I certainly wasn't aware of, and how that was sometimes being used in terms of packaging waste and addressing fines issues, whatever. Can you talk to us about both those issues?
Yeah, of course. So the packaging waste regime, I guess, is one of our original kind of polluter pays sets of regulations. And what it does is it says if you're a business that handles more than 50 tonnes of packaging waste per year and you turn over more than £2 million, then you have to register with the Environment Agency as a packaging waste producer.
Right.
And then it means that you have to do certain things. You have to put together an annual submission which says this is the quantity of packaging that I've handled. And you also have to calculate what's known as your obligation. So effectively, as a business, how much do you need to pay towards that being recycled? And so that's the crux of it. And we've seen a real uptick, and it's interesting because I've noticed it. And then, of course, having joined DAC BEACHCROFT and talking to colleagues, they'd also noticed the same thing, which is the Environment Agency haven't really advertised that they're having a crackdown on this, but they do publish a list every 6 months of businesses that have accepted these undertakings that you referred to. And you notice that a lot of them were to do with packaging waste, and also that a lot of big names had been either caught or had proactively put forward the fact that they had been in breach of these regulations. So it does seem that there has been something of an uptick. Now, in terms of what an enforcement undertaking is, it's a civil measure. So it's not a criminal measure. It's a civil measure that the Environment Agency use. And they really like it. And businesses tend to, well, if they don't like it, but they prefer it to being prosecuted, certainly. And what the enforcement undertaking is, it's either something that you can proactively offer, so you realise actually we should have registered to do this packaging waste compliance, we haven't, and therefore we're going to actually put ourselves forward to the EA and say we're terribly sorry, we've not done this. Or, of course, if the EA find out about it, it can be a reactive situation where they say to you, what are you going to do? Will you accept one of these undertakings?
Oh, okay, they can do that.
And in doing it, basically, you are saying, okay, we're in breach of the regulations, but you're not prosecuted, which is, for a lot of companies, it is really, really important. And I think both sides like it because it's quicker. So you can quickly dispose of it, no pun intended. Yes. You can quickly deal with the case. And although it is a matter of public record, you don't get anything like the adverse publicity that you get through being prosecuted and going to court. And basically an enforcement undertaking is you accepting the responsibility for the breach. And the remedial steps, the kind of mitigation that we talked about in a health and safety context, how, you've joined a compliance scheme, this is how you're going to make sure you're not going to re-offend, if you like. And there's also a financial element that goes with it, and that will be made up partly of the EA's costs in dealing with you, but also it's partly an offer of a financial contribution, usually to an environmental charity or a local environmental community group. And so the reason why lots of people like it is actually because they're saying, okay, we've done the wrong thing, but we can see that our financial penalty is actually going into improving the environment.
Yeah.
And, there is a discussion, in my view, to be had about whether we ought to consider similar things from a health and safety perspective. The HSE don't do this at the moment. I don't think there's any suggestion that they're going to start anytime soon. But if you're fined in a health and safety case, that money just goes into the Treasury, and who knows then whether it comes back into any health and safety purpose. So it's I personally quite like it. I think it's good. I think it's helpful, and as I say, I think clients like it because not only is it a quicker and more straightforward way of dealing with matters, it also it's a good feeling to be able to put something back into the environment.
So is it only used in terms of packaging breaches, that then, this enforcement?
No, they use it in a range of other offences too. But yeah, I know this issue with the packaging waste I'd noticed particularly through the list of the list that they publish. So that they'll do it for some water pollution offences as well. So you can see, for example, some of the utility companies getting fines into the, you know, 6 figures. Sorry, not fines, but paying enforcement undertakings into 6 figures for water pollution. So it's not just packaging waste.
So they're not insignificant, some of these if we're calling them fines, some of these undertakings that they're accepting. Some of them are quite significant, but as opposed to going to court, getting a bigger fine, and actually, as you say, you can spin it slightly more positively by saying, well, yeah, we have done this, but we're contributing to this, you know, water quality or whatever.
Exactly. And you know, and also, you know, although you will generally involve a lawyer to help you negotiate it, you have to spend a lot less time with people like me than you would if you were going to a trial in court. So
well, that's right. And we know a good lawyer, don't we? If we need one, Rhian, we know when we can call on. So Rhian, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
DAC BEACHCROFT. Find you on LinkedIn, websites. You've got a massive footprint, but it sounds like it around the country as well. Some expert legal advice there on health, safety, environmental management, and food safety as well. So forget the food safety. It's been a pleasure as always to talk to you. Thanks ever so much for your time today.
Thank you.